Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, while the breach on Capitol Hill is at the center of President Trump's second impeachment trial, Erin Hawley, wife of GOP Senator Josh Hawley, is sharing details about protesters that gathered outside their Virginia home in early January. As a lawyer and an associate professor of law at the University of Missouri, she weighs in on the division in the country and responds to backlash over her husband objecting to affirm President Biden's election victory. Teachers, unions, and school boards continue to clash over how to safely return to in-person learning amid the coronavirus pandemic. Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, discusses reopening debates and the challenges to flesh out President Biden's push to reopen schools within his first 100 days in office. Plus commentary from Guy Benson, host of The Guy Benson Show. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Kennedy.
I'm Bill Hemmer, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, February 12th, 2021. I'm Gernal Scott. Reaction to our political discourse can often bring protests and fear to a family's doorstep. Erin Hawley, wife of Republican Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, talks about her experience.
So I think I had two initial thoughts. One, can I protect Abigail? And two, oh my goodness, I am so glad my two boys are not here, as they would be absolutely terrified.
I'm Lisa Brady. How to reopen schools. Can new CDC guidance help cool a heated debate?
I worry about this recklessness about trying to pit educators versus kids.
And I'm Guy Benson. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Lawmakers in the United States Congress make many decisions that affect Americans, some that people like and some they don't. The reaction to those very decisions have evolved from simple spirited debate to personal attacks and in-your-face protests that many will tell you have contributed to the breakdown of our political and civil discourse. Families of lawmakers are not immune, often seeing the anger they have little direct involvement with up close. On January 4th, 2 days before the violence at the Capitol that is now at the center of former President Trump's second impeachment trial, protesters gathered outside the Virginia home of Senator Josh Hawley and his family. The Missouri Republicans' decision to object to affirm Joe Biden's election victory would later get him dropped from a major publisher. But that night brought angry demonstrators literally to his front door.
So at first was just a little bit of disbelief.
Erin Hawley is a lawyer, professor, and the wife of Missouri Republican Senator Josh Hawley.
I was downstairs watching TV. My husband and two boys were at home in Missouri, so I was home alone with our then 7-week-old daughter, Abigail. And we were watching a Hallmark show, so just having a good girls' evening when we heard shouts outside. I came upstairs and saw about 15 to 20 protesters standing outside. They were shouting into bullhorns. I, of course, had no idea who they were or what precisely they wanted. And again, was home alone with Abigail. And I think as any parent, as any mom is worried about, you just want to be able to protect your child. So I think I had two initial thoughts. One, can I protect Abigail? And two, oh my goodness, I am so glad my two boys are not here, as they would be absolutely terrified.
You dealt with it and you confronted these folks. You went out and said, look, I have family here. There are neighbors around here. Please take this somewhere else or something like that. And they continued. And I guess the anxiety began to heighten at that point.
Yes, I asked the protesters to leave. I told them that we had a new baby and that we also had neighbors. And that, this is obviously not an appropriate place to have a protest late at night when other families are trying to go about their evening business as well as our own family. And yes, when they didn't leave, that does sort of heighten the situation. I went back downstairs with Abby and then heard shouting up close and pounding, and I came upstairs, and there were at least 3 men on my front porch. We've got, an ordinary door with some side windows, and they basically took up the whole front of my porch and were shouting into bullhorns. And at that point, I started to get a little nervous, as anyone would. And it's a real invasion of the safety of your home to have people on your porch shouting in bullhorns, people you don't know who they are, what their specific intent is, whether they're dangerous. And again, this is all at night when they're sure or nearly sure that a family will be home, which is just completely inappropriate.
And you talked about the police response, and they did come and they did try to get these folks to disperse. But even in the time that it took them to respond, which was a relatively short amount of time, when you're in the middle of it, when you're in the throes of it, it seems like forever.
Absolutely. And if you just think about it, there's glass outside of a lot of doors, and you break the glass and you turn the knob, and it wouldn't take long for someone to get into most homes. So you're thinking all of that when you're there by yourself. And I'm grateful for their response. And it's my understanding that they informed the protesters that they were violating several different laws, and they eventually did disperse. But again, while you're, waiting for police to come, there's a lot that can happen in that time frame. And even if nothing happens, I again cannot express how grateful I am that our 2 small boys were not home. They are 6 years old and 8 years old, and one in particular is already afraid of the dark. Much like any child of that age is often afraid of the dark and afraid of someone getting in. And the idea that he would have seen these people out in the dark shouting with bullhorns, or the idea that he would have heard them up on the porch shouting into our house, I am so thankful that he wasn't here for that. And the idea that he might experience that someday really just breaks my heart as a mom, because it's our responsibility to protect our children to the best of our ability. So it's just my hope and prayer that he does not experience anything like that.
While I have you here, and I know this is what you recounted was January 4th, I have to ask you about 2 days later and what happened at the U.S. Capitol. And I'm sure you, like me, like many of us, watched that day as people stormed the Capitol and overran security. And I'm sure your phone was working overtime that day, at least trying to get in touch with your husband to make sure he was okay. What were you feeling that day?
Again, just a sense of disbelief and really fear for my husband. It's one thing when you're there and possibly can do something about it, but when you're just hearing about it and watching it, it really you have no sense of control. And so just was praying for my husband's safety, for his colleagues' safety. And as you said, just a tragic and terrible events. And we are thankful as a family that my husband was safe, and feel very deeply for the loss that was sustained that day.
You're aware a lot of people, and many of them are Democrats, many of them people who have followed the political process, have warranted or not pointed fingers at your husband, alleging that in some way on that day he somehow encouraged the rioters on January 6th. If you could not have an argument but a conversation with somebody who perhaps stood in that corner, what would you talk to them about? What would you say in perhaps to change their mind?
Well, I love what you say about having a conversation. And I would tell them, first of all, that Josh is a good man. He has a good heart. He loves his boys. He's a good husband. And I would urge them to get to know him, as our neighbors have, who have been so generous with their support, notwithstanding many who have contrary political views. So I would urge them to get to know him. And if they did so, they would realize the notion that he encouraged any sort of violence is absolutely ridiculous.
Senator Hawley, of course, knee-deep in this Senate impeachment trial as a jury member. Some have speculated as to how he'll vote when this ultimately comes to the point where he has to vote. Only he knows that for sure. You may have some idea, but only he knows that for sure. But, and I know of no other way to really ask this, but to ask this point blank. That day, on January 6th, among all the members of Congress who were on Capitol Hill at that time, and your husband was one of them, his safety was at risk. Should the rhetoric of the former president, Donald Trump, and others who spoke at the rally earlier that day be held accountable for that? And I ask that of you not as someone who is part of or who knows the political process, but as a wife who, for some time that day, wasn't sure how this was going to play out.
Well, as you said, as a wife, as a spouse, it is terrifying when those you love are under threat in any way, including from serious threats to their safety, as happened on January 6th. And I think it's absolutely right and proper that those individuals who breached the boundaries of the Capitol be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I am not as familiar with the president's rhetoric, so I cannot speak to that. But I am very much in favor of those who broke the law being prosecuted. Because we live in a society who's built on the idea that we have this democratic process that's representative. And to break in to the representative's house is really a threat to all of us. Those people should and are being prosecuted.
I recently had a conversation with former Congressman Trey Gowdy, and I asked him about what we can do to perhaps repair our political rhetoric. I will ask you the same question, but in a bit of a different vein. If you could make a suggestion as to how we can repair our political rhetoric, but I'll add in the fact that it's not always the politician that suffers the slings and arrows. In this era of social media and the internet, people can find their families and terrorize them as well, as you have experienced. How do we get past that? How do we solve this?
I think we realize that we're all people and that we're all Americans. And for the most part, people have good intentions. As you mentioned, it's often the family these days that gets caught in the crosshairs. My sister-in-law, her office had a bomb threat. We've had all sorts of threats to our family's safety on social media. I changed my phone number. I shut down Instagram. Instagram's supposed to be the happy social media, but not so much. And so I think that all of these actions are just really damaging to the fabric of our democracy because they don't engage people as people. And we need people who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, regardless of the blowback on social media or on Twitter. And I think my husband is one of those people. And we need people who are willing to look one another in the eye and say what it is. As you might in law school, you can have a candid debate about these sorts of issues rather than resorting to social media and the anonymity that sort of platform brings. So really talking to people, getting to know where they're coming from, all of these things are really elementary. But in today's sort of click first and send your tweet first culture, we're really missing out on just that human element and the fact that most people really do mean well.
Erin Hawley, we are glad you are safe, and I do want to thank you for your candor, your honesty, and your time to talk about this issue. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Guy Benson with your Fox News commentary coming up.
School districts around the country are about to have more information on what it would take to get kids and teachers back into classrooms.
The president wants schools to open safely and in accord with science.
White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki has been deferring questions on specifics to the CDC ahead of the new guidelines they're releasing. But reporters have tried to drill down on the president's goal of having most K-8 schools reopen in his first 100 days.
The majority of schools, so more than 50%, open by day 100 of his presidency. And that means some teaching in classrooms. So at least one day a week. Hopefully it's more.
Skeptics say the president just doesn't want to take on the teachers' unions, part of his core support. Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio telling Fox News,
they've just redefined what opening schools means. They've defined it as something that's virtually already happening so that they can claim they did it.
In the meantime, there's been a tug of war in some districts over reopening plans, leading to lawsuits and public feuds. When Chicago finally reached a tentative deal with its teachers union recently, Mayor Lori Lightfoot had kind words for the teachers.
You have been champions, all while fighting through this roller coaster of your own personal emotions and dealing with your personal health and your family. I understand that, and I want to thank you.
But she said parents and students had told her they felt held hostage. And while thousands of union members voted for the deal, thousands also voted against it. But if the basics of pandemic safety are known, masks, social distancing, testing, and tracing, why aren't more schools already back to in-person learning?
There's several issues. One is that, you got about 13,000 districts that are doing 13,000 things.
Randi Weingarten is president of the American Federation of Teachers, which put out its own blueprint for a gradual reopening last April.
The districts that have not reopened for in-person learning, many of them have not had the money to make the ventilation changes, have not had the money to purchase the PPE, did not have the money for the sanitation and the hygiene and the cleaning. And a lot of them got that kind of money in the December package. So that was a really good first step. The second is the lack of putting in these mitigation strategies with fidelity that people would trust. And so what you're seeing right now in the districts that have just, had new agreements in the last few days, there are now parent and teacher committees that are making sure that the mitigation strategies are really put into effect, and that they are there to provide safety for students and for staff. The last issue is we got to make sure that people have the vaccine availability. Teachers should be part of the priority for vaccines. That priority should be aligned with in-school learning. And some states are doing that and some are not. I applaud Washington, D.C. for really trying to make educator vaccinations a priority in reopening schools. I applaud West Virginia for doing that. But then basically, Florida refused to do that. Florida basically said that no essential worker was essential enough to be in the head of the line in terms of vaccine prioritization.
Let's talk about the president's goal for a minute, because do you feel like he kind of backed himself into a corner by saying that most K-8 schools should be reopened in the first 100 days, and now the White House has kind of had to backtrack when pressed on it and say, well, even one day of in-person learning per week would count toward, meeting that goal? I mean, there's kind of yeah, go ahead.
I don't see the White House as backtracking on this. I think what's happened is we live in a society where Donald Trump never let the scientists speak fulsomely. So most people didn't even know what was in the original CDC guidelines, which basically said that to reopen schools safely, you had to have a series of mitigation strategies that included masking and physical distancing. If you actually understand physical distancing, nothing that Jen Psaki said this week would surprise you, because, it means that you have to have enough space and enough clustering of kids to reopen safely, so that there's enough space in between people. And so we thought last school year, as the school year started, that would essentially mean you need about 20 or 30% more space in schools. And if you don't have that, that's going to mean much more of a hybrid. And I think that's what Jen Psaki was saying. So it's literally taking these scientific guidelines and making it real for people. And that's why you have so many school districts that are doing hybrid, because that's the number of kids that they can have in school, given the space and the number of teachers they have.
Now, federal health officials have said that based on the science, it's not necessary to have all of the teachers vaccinated before you have in-person learning resuming. But that has been an issue that's been under debate in some of the districts as they tried to reach agreements. And in San Francisco, where they did reach an agreement after the city sued the school district, the mayor, London Breed, is now raising doubts about whether they can go forward with the reopening right at this time, because she's saying, it does call for all teachers to be vaccinated, but they have a vaccine supply issue.
So the bottom line is, you can't have it both ways. We can't actually say that essential workers are essential, and we're trying to vaccinate them first because their work is essential, and then say, but we really didn't mean it. So yes, vaccinations are not a prerequisite. It's not a prerequisite that every single school teacher be vaccinated before you reopen in-person learning. But the CDC has made teachers, just like healthcare workers, priorities. And so that means in a city, a mayor has to actually put aside some of the vaccines that a mayor gets for the city to do that. And what, the San Francisco mayor is saying in that position right now is that she doesn't want to do what clearly the mayor in DC just did, what the West Virginia governor just did. So it's not that what vaccines do is that they create another layer of protection. And I'm really glad that we're seeing educators clamor for the vaccines. I thought we'd have much more of a problem in terms of vaccine hesitancy, and we have some of that. But I'm really glad to see educators seeing that vaccines can provide another layer. So is it a prerequisite that every teacher gets vaccinated before you reopen public schools in person? No. But should we be aligning vaccine prioritization and vaccine availability with in-school learning? Of course.
I wanted to dig in a little, too, on the give and take that happened in Chicago before they reached their tentative agreement, where the mayor basically said, look, the schools are safe, and the union basically said, no, they're not safe enough. And there's been this public perception around that, or at least it seemed like it at times, that the union was being portrayed as kind of the bad guy in this fight. Are you worried about that perception going forward?
I worry about this recklessness about trying to pit educators versus kids. And unfortunately, the mayor in Chicago did this. There is a healthy skepticism in districts that have had austerity heaped upon them, that things that are going to be promised are not delivered. And so for the mayor to stand up and say, trust me, this is going to happen, when we have years and years of austerity and disinvestment in Chicago, people didn't trust it. They said, let's actually make sure we have this in writing and that it's enforceable. And the mayor didn't want to do that. And so ultimately, they got to a point where they did that. But it was really unfortunate, because it was only after there was a strike vote that the mayor took these negotiations seriously. If the mayor took those negotiations seriously weeks beforehand, it would never have gotten to a strike vote. And so ultimately, look at what happened in New York City. In New York City, we negotiated a whole set of safety protocols that would make schools safe for reopening of in-school learning. And frankly, around the country, parents get that if teachers believe that it's safe, then it's going to be safe for their kids. Do we know that in-school learning is really important? Yes, we're school teachers. We would have told you before COVID that remote education wasn't so great. But we need to make sure that it's safe. And part of why we have been negotiating and putting out plans since last April is because we knew that it was really important to have in-school learning for kids, to develop relationships, develop resilience. But we also know for our kids, for our parents, and for ourselves, we need to be safe.
Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network. In these ever-changing times, you can rely on Fox News for hourly updates for the very latest news and information on your time. Listen and download now at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
The coronavirus pandemic has meant doing without a lot of things many of us took for granted. One of the simplest things on that list? A hug. It's been especially difficult for people with loved ones in nursing homes or long-term care facilities. So our good news this week comes from Colorado, where an assisted living center in suburban Denver came up with a way to make it possible for family members to safely hug their relatives who stay there. Juniper Village set up a hug tent outside the facility where all of the residents and staff have been vaccinated. It's made of a lot of construction-grade plastic sheeting, complete with plastic sleeves. The Associated Press reports that similar tents have popped up around the country and at places like Brazil and England, where some people call them cuddle curtains. Amanda Meyer is the project coordinator for the nonprofit healthcare organization True Community Care and said she, her husband, and some volunteers built the hug tent around a standard 8-by-8-foot pop-up frame and attached the construction-grade plastic with glue and Velcro. The plastic arm sleeves built into the tent are attached with embroidery hoops. Since the beginning of November, she's helped set up 4 of those hug tents in Colorado and said the feedback has been positive. She says initially it's kind of weird to be hugging through plastic, but the benefits are clear and that you can see a sort of relief in their bodies and faces when they finally get to have physical contact. Hugs. Just one more thing we won't take for granted. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary. Guy Benson. What's on your mind?
As tens of millions of Americans are now vaccinated against coronavirus, some people are wringing their hands saying that even after people get vaccinated, the risk isn't zero, and therefore we should all curtail talk about getting back to normal anytime soon. The White House press secretary added from the podium last week that even after vaccinations, people are going to have to stick to a program of social distancing and mask wearing. I fear that this sort of negativity may persuade people who are on the fence not to get vaccines if they feel like the goalposts are ever shifting. But here's the reality. The New York Times recently reported, quote, all 5 vaccines with public results have eliminated COVID-19 deaths. They have also drastically reduced hospitalizations, end quote. We should be responsible and careful, but we shouldn't needlessly discourage people either. The proven promise of these vaccines is something to celebrate, not downplay or frame as not good enough. This is Guy Benson, host of The Guy Benson Show.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. From the Fox News Podcasts Network, subscribe and listen to the Trey Gowdy Podcast. Former federal prosecutor and 4-term U.S. Congressman from South Carolina brings you a one-of-a-kind podcast. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.